So welcome to the Emerging Researchers Association Gerontology and Tonic meeting, Bruce. Really nice to meet you. We were very interested in your very interesting career, your accidental gerontologist title, and the very interesting work that you do on dementia. So I'll let you explain a little bit about your career, how you got into aging research, and then your current research,
Mhm.
and then Carol will field the questions, if that's okay, Carol. As I think that's how I first met you, Carol.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fine. I'll keep an eye out on things in the chat. So the accidental gerontologist bit came out of the conversation with Senna, which was asking me about to do this, and I said I ended up doing gerontology by happenstance, and then Senna came up with the phrase accidental gerontologist, and I thought that was a lovely phrase, and I'm keeping it. Thank you very much. It's mine now. So I will talk a little bit about career history, I suppose, and then that will see into talking about the work I'm doing at the minute. And I thought I'd give you some slides to look at rather than um, my face. Um, so here we go. So we can get the slides going. All right then. So can you see the slides?
Yes,
Yeah, cool. Right then.
thanks.
I'll just do it like this because if I go to share screen, it might just come up. There we go. Right. So, um,
Just to say, Bruce, I don't know, you're not quite in slideshow mode,
okay.
not on the my screen, so I don't know whether at the
All right
moment we
then.
can see the preview of all of them. So,
All right. Let me see if I can.
um,
Oops. Let's try that again. Press the wrong button. There we go. Hang on. There we go. Right.
oh,
No. Right then. Okay.
it's it's not, yeah. At least
Lean.
I do apologise because we could actually see the slides. It was just in that preview mode. So, oh, here we go. Yep, perfect.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Right then. So yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about sort of how I ended up in gerontology and career stuff, and then a little bit about the project I'm doing now, which is around people leaving volunteering later in life. So I started out as an engineering metallurgist. I did my PhD in Southampton back in the early mid 90s. Doing well, whenever someone asks you about your PhD, the answer is the title. So my PhD was the fatigue response of fiber reinforced aluminium lithium laminates. There you go. I did that and quite enjoyed doing research, so I stayed, but I shifted sub-discipline and I ended up doing research, empirical research in the hot rolling of steel and aluminium, hence the picture on the top right-hand corner. Um, I started off doing very empirical stuff and it got slightly more microstructure as we went along. Did that for a while in Sheffield and then for 4 years at the Technical University of Delft in the Netherlands. Um, Towards the end of that, I decided I could do something else. And I wasn't quite sure what something else was. And then my wife suggested that I should work in a museum, which is weird because neither of us knew anybody who works in museums. It just seemed like a good idea. So we relocated back to the UK, to Newcastle. I did an MA in museum studies, and then I became an assistant learning officer at two art galleries, the Shipley Art Gallery in Gateshead, which is the one you can see here, and the Lang Art Gallery in Newcastle. And whilst I was doing that, I was responsible for working with school groups and the Shipley Art Gallery if you ever get the chance to go, has a fabulous collection of contemporary craft. So I did a lot of object handling with small children, which is the picture you can see in the bottom right. One of the things about the heritage sector is that a lot of organizations won't take on learning staff unless they've got teaching qualifications. So at the end of my contract there, I trained as a primary school teacher. I'm still not sure that was a good idea, but you know, you live. And then at the end of that, then it all got really messy. So I started. Well, my wife and I started juggling work and children, basically. So I did 2 days a week work as a placement manager at the university and 3 days a week being dad. And whilst my children were at school, then I would run around being a freelance educator and researcher in cultural heritage. And along with a lot of freelancers, I would do anything that anyone paid me for, as long as I thought I could do it and, you know, deliver. Because of doing the object handling and because of doing the primary teaching, I got really interested in the question of what happens when you give somebody an object. You put something in their hands, what is going on? And I found the answers that were coming out of sort of cognitive neuroscience really, really interesting and really helpful. So I've been doing a lot of reading around that, but I had no proof that I knew anything. So I had some spare time, as you do. So I did another master's in psychology, which is like a conversion master's to try and get my head into that, which is really good. And then around about that time, I then started picking up more research work within the university. So I ended up doing more research and teaching in cultural heritage. So what you might have noticed so far is that there's no mention of gerontology. So that sort of started, this is where I get why it's an accidental gerontologist. That started in 2010, and I got hired into a project called the Aging Health and Vitality Project, which was around the impact of museums on older people, their health and well-being. And I got hired into it not because I knew anything about older people, because I didn't know a damn thing, but it was a collaboration between the local museum services and the university, and neither side really understood the other side. And I'd worked in both. So I was more or less as a liaison person, helping the university researchers understand the museum service and helping the museum service work with the researchers. Got through that, I sort of did what I usually do, which is start reading and trying to understand the sort of the politics around aging health and well-being, because working in cultural heritage is inherently political, and you sort of have to understand that political domain because that tells you a lot about money and all the rest of it. Anyway, that then fed into doing some desk-based research for the outreach team at Tinyware Archives and Museums, because they'd been doing lots of digital storytelling, and they wanted to see what evidence there was in the literature for the impact of digital storytelling on people with dementia. So I did that. That was really interesting. Wrote up a report for them. It's online, tucked away in a blog on object handling. And that then led into other bits. So I did some work for Beamish. Beamish is a large open-air museum in the northeast of England, and they do some fabulous work with older men with various mental health issues. And they wanted to explore unobtrusive methods for observing and capturing what was going on in those sessions. And you can see us in the bottom right-hand corner planting bulbs outside the cottage where they used to do their sessions. That fed into another project, which was about the impact of reminiscence for people with dementia in open-air museums, 5 open-air museums across Europe, Beamish being one of them. And that was a really interesting and sometimes frustrating project, which involved us as the sort of cultural heritage academics, but also academics in psychology and in nursing as well. We did that. And then in 2016, I got hired into, so by this point, I just get hired into stuff. It's very much, I'm almost like a freelancer on an internal market, and people would hire me to do stuff. So I got hired to do data analysis from the interviews that were done as part of the Dementia and Imagination project, which was all about the impact of visual arts for people living with dementia. And it's sort of in there that came across a bit of data that was then the starting point for the work that I'm doing now. So this is the data that was a starting point from what I'm working on, and I'll just read it out because the font's quite small. It's a man being interviewed, and he says, "Well, there's another thing as well. I'm a member of an organization, and until 3 days ago, I've been with the organization for 5 or 6 years, and I used to go every Sunday to act as a room guide there. And I literally packed up last weekend, so I can't go there anymore. So I have to find something else to do on a Sunday now." Now, what was striking about this is he said this 13 times across the course of the interview. He was never asked. This was not what the interview was about. He just needed to say this. And some of the guidance I've seen about working with people with dementia suggested that if someone is saying something over and over again, then it's indicative of an underlying and unresolved tension. So what I took away from this was that actually he was really upset. He'd been asked to stop volunteering as he saw it, and he'd lost this routine in his life, and he didn't know what he was going to do. And it struck me that I'd never heard anyone talk about that. People talk about, there's lots of stuff on volunteering in museums, the impact it has for volunteers, and the fact that museums need them. But I'd not heard anyone talk about this. So I got some internal money to do a pilot project on the end of volunteering. It was really great for me because it was internal money, and people like myself who were on fixed term contracts were allowed to apply. So it was like the first time I got to be a PI on a really tiny project, but it was a great opportunity. And I worked with 3 venues in the northeast of England, all heritage venues, because that's sort of where I'm based in sort of cultural heritage. I worked with a really tiny heritage centre. I worked with a big regional museum, and I worked with a national charity that has sites all over the country, including the Northeast. And if you know your museums, you can probably guess which ones those are. And I interviewed volunteers, ex-volunteers, and staff to try and find out, is this issue of people having to leave a question worth exploring? And we did the research, and then I did further dissemination work through organizations like Heritage Volunteering Group and Make Your Mark, so talking to volunteer managers, and the answer was a definite yes. Yes, this is an issue that no one's talking about academically, and that volunteer managers were experiencing, but they found that the policies and procedures that they had didn't deal with this. So usually the volunteer policy will say, have an exit interview, and you're done. And that's the end of it. It doesn't really talk about this sort of issue. So that was really encouraging. We got that published. That took a while because it was a really tiny study, and so it took a while to find someone who was willing to publish it. But we did get it published, and because we got it published, that then established track records that I was able to put in for a ESL Senior Investigator grant, which to my immense relief was successful. And that led to the current project, which is what started in January. So same rough topic, reframing slightly changed. I'll work with 8 case study cultural heritage organizations across the country. I'll rattle through them for you because it helps me to remember them. Amberley Museum, which is a tiny open-air museum in Sussex. Bradford District Museum and Galleries, so local authority museum in north of England with very diverse population around it. Devil's Porridge Museum, which you've probably never heard of. Devil's Porridge is a community-established museum in Scotland, based in an old munitions factory. Apparently, someone described what the factory made as the Devil's Porridge, and the name stuck. A cathedral, I haven't got permission to name them yet. The National Railway Museum and Locomotion, National Mining Museum of Scotland, Natural History Museum of London, and then finally Tees Cottage Pumping Station. And I can guarantee you have never heard of Tees Cottage Pumping Station. It is a tiny volunteer-run heritage site with scheduled ancient monument status in the northeast of England. But then, with Tees Cottage, I've got volunteers managing volunteers. And at the other end of the spectrum, I've got the Natural History Museum, which has a massive staff infrastructure, policies galore, and the public transport infrastructure and being in London. So I've got all sorts of contrast built into it. And again, I'm going to interview volunteers, ex-volunteers, and volunteer managers. So analyze the data, have reflective conversations with them, and then do a survey of volunteer managers across all volunteer involving sectors in the UK. So not just heritage. And then at the end, I'm going to produce something, I hope, which I'm steadfast refusing to call a toolkit because I hate the word toolkit. But because it's so individualistic, a repertoire of possible responses, but repertoire sounds quite posh as well. So I'm stuck. But anyway, basically coming up with this is the issue and these are ways that people have successfully dealt with it. So the people who are encountering it then have got possibilities they can draw on to deal with the issue they are facing, because it's always going to be deeply personal and deeply individual. So what we found, to go back to the pilot study, leaving volunteering in later life is more or less inevitable. That bit of data I showed you from D&I, the gentleman was asked to leave because he had dementia. However, it doesn't have to be dementia. It could be other health issues. It could be loss of mobility. It could be caring responsibilities. There's a range of issues why someone might leave, but overall, you see a big drop-off in volunteering over the age of 75. So it's more or less inevitable. And what we found in the pilot study was that participants either anticipated or experienced leaving volunteering as a form of loss. Not everyone did. One person at least said, no, if this doesn't work for me anymore, I'm just going to stop and I'll walk away from it. So it's not inevitable, but lots of people did. And drawing on literature on retirement, that has the potential for further longer-term impacts post-volunteering, which is the bit I'm really interested in getting at in the current study. But there are possibilities for personal agency which may ameliorate the impacts, again, drawing on retirement literature. So if you have more control over how you leave, then you might feel greater life satisfaction after you've left or after you've moved on to something else. But there's also, it's worth bearing in mind, positive forms of agency where you have control and what you might call a negative form of agency, like where somebody lies just about their health condition so they can keep on going. It's not really, it is agency, they're taking control. It's just not, necessarily a very useful one long term. And then for the volunteer managers, what came out was a sequence of themes. So a lot of organizations have policies and values. The smaller organizations tend to draw on boilerplate texts. Larger organizations have more bespoke policies and clear frameworks, and that creates frameworks and provides confidence for the volunteer managers, but it leaves them space to work with people as individuals. What's really important in all of this is the relationship between the staff and the volunteers. It's very different to the relationship between management and staff. And there's something about balancing closeness and interpersonal relationships with professionalism and finding that balance. What there's also in the data is a perceived sense of organizational reciprocity. So a sense that the staff felt, particularly for long-term volunteers, that they ought to give back to the volunteers because of all the time that the volunteers have given to them. And that's really important because that then, when you're working with volunteers, there's a sort of, if you like, a cost-benefit analysis. How much effort do you have to put into a volunteer and how much benefit do you get out of the volunteer? And at some point, you might say, if you're being clearly cynical, when the cost outweighs the benefit, you should stop. Okay, but the organizational reciprocity shifts that calculation. So what happens is you see evidence of people going further than the rules demand, further than that cost-benefit analysis demands, to support people in continuing their volunteering. But there are limits to that. And what's really problematic for the volunteer management staff is that there's no predefined limit. It's always encountered and rationalized in an ad hoc basis. And the problem is that oftentimes it's encountered, so it's like we can't do any more. And that actually has an emotional impact on staff because they've gone to it's almost like they've gone as far as they can, but then they feel really bad and they're also emotionally drained. So it's tricky that how you deal with that. So there were loads of really interesting issues that came out of the pilot study, which are not easily resolved. But here you go. So what is the relationship between the volunteer involving organisation, particularly the volunteer managers, and the older volunteers? That's a really interesting one to sort of nail down. And does everyone recognise that within a large organisation? Because senior management might not recognise it in the way that volunteer managers do. That's a different research question, which I'm trying to put another bit in for. Personal agency matters. If personal agency matters, how do you support that? And where do the limits of this reciprocity lie for the organisation? And really interestingly, if you think about your relationship with your employer, for most of us, the university, once we leave our university, the university does not care about us, if we're being honest. The moral obligation between the organisation and the volunteer is different. And this idea, and what you see is that the moral obligation implicit in that, the question is, does it extend beyond the duration of someone's involvement? Does the organisation still have a responsibility to that person after they've left? And particularly for organisations with a social ethos, the answer might be yes. But then how you deal with that practically is a whole other kettle of fish. And then the last one is about what we've been talking about so far, is basically put the museum at the centre. But if you swap it round and you put the person at the centre, the volunteer at the centre, then you start to see heritage organisations being a part of somebody's supportive network, or if you like, their ecosystem of care. So this is part of the thing that helps them maintain their active living in a healthy way. So now there's a question about, well, do the heritage organisations actually want that role? Do they want to be part of that network, that ecosystem? And if they do, what would it mean for them if they accepted responsibility for that? Because that would imply significant change of practice. And that's me done. So I will close that down. I'll stop share. There you go.